Thanks for continuing to work with me through these videos where I've been talking about global climate change down to the Outer Hebrides and how we go about understanding future changes and past changes in our climate. And here I want to focus on what is my principal work, which is the UK Climate Projections, or UKCP. This is a body of work where we are looking at future changes in climate and understanding how those changes will impact on people and the United Kingdom as a whole. Now, at a top level, we have some headline messages, and that is that based on what we've seen, there is a greater chance of the United Kingdom experiencing warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. We have this range of projections from a statistical analyses of climate and climate model projections through to projections using climate models at global levels and these regional levels for just the European area, or just focusing on the British Isles. And we also have observations and marine projections looking at sea level rise. Now, we look at future UK winters. On the top, we have temperature, and the bottom, we have precipitation. And what you can see here is you have in the middle, we have sort of the mean UK response, and then on the left, the lowest from the ensemble members, and on the right, the highest response from the ensemble members. And these are differences or anomalies between the period 2061 to 2080 and 1980 to 2000. And you can see that there are, in the winters, warming is everywhere. Winter warming is UK-wide, with the strongest changes in the southeast of England. That is particularly apparent in the lowest projection members. Similarly, for precipitation or rainfall, the increases across much of the country, although we do see some subtle changes or sorts of very minor decreases across northern Scotland. But in the highest projection member here on the right, you can see the precipitation increases across the whole country. Into the summer, and using the same sets of plots and the same anomaly period, you can see that the warming is again UK-wide, but again is stronger in the south. But this time it's more actually south and south central regions, so not just confined to the southeast. In terms of precipitation, it decreases almost everywhere. There's maybe a very small possibility of some increases in northern Scotland, and you see that the strongest decreases are actually occurring in southwestern England and southern and western Wales. But we're also not just looking at our average response in these periods, we're also concerned about changes in more extreme events. Now, the summer of 2018 remains, at time of recording, our warmest summer on record. We may have had the 40-degree heat wave in the July of 2022, but actually that summer was marginally cooler than as a whole than 2018. Now, you can see here in this graph that by the 2018 heat wave, by the time of occurring, was a sort of about a 1 in 5 year event, about 20% occurrence. And back in 1990, almost 30 years earlier, it was a very, very tiny event, maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 30 or more unlikely event. By 2050, in both the low emissions in blue and the high emissions in orange future scenarios, the chance of a summer like 2018 is around 50%. So you'd expect one statistically almost every other year, you would expect that sort of summer. By the end of the century to 2090, you could see that actually in the low emission scenario, that hasn't really changed from 2050. It's stayed at about that 50% occurrence. But in a high emission scenario, essentially we'd expect in 2018 summer to be occurring every year. What we now consider to be our most extreme summer would actually be our average condition, which sort of particularly highlights how, whether we have a low emissions or high emissions future, that sort of stark changes by the end of the century in particular. Now, another thing I want to touch on here is actually the sort of imagery that gets used, and it's sort of a bit of a tangent what we're talking about focusing on here. But there's been some recent commentary by Dr. Saffron O'Neill at the University of Exeter, And she has discussed this issue, and there's a link to here about whether or not actually the media uses appropriate images of heat waves. Heat waves often focus on images of people enjoying the sun, sat on the beach, playing in fountains, swimming in outdoor pools. It's a great and glorious thing. Whereas actually, as we saw when the 40-degree heat wave last in the summer of 2022 triggered fires, grassland fires in southern London, actually the more appropriate image might have been of people's homes being burnt out, people being made homeless, people struggling and suffering because of the heat. And that if you're interested in that sort of social side of these sort of changes, I'd recommend checking out what Dr. O'Neill wrote there. Of interest around the whole of the British Isles, but particularly for the Outer Hebrides, is future changes in sea level. And you can see in this figure, we have sea level rise in the low emission scenario again in blue, and the high emission scenario again in orange. And we've got the four national capital cities: Cardiff, Belfast, Edinburgh, and London. And you can see that there is a range. We have, uncertainty, and it's probably worth pointing out these are the values 2100. Sea level will continue to rise beyond 2100, and within the UKCP projections, we do actually have extended projections out to 2300. You can see that for Edinburgh and Belfast, you're looking at, in the highest emission scenario, around just shy of a metre of sea level at the very top end of the projection, whereas at the bottom end of the lowest emission scenario may be only sort of 10 centimeters of sea level rise. In the south of England and in Wales, you can see that those values are slightly higher. That's driven particularly by the fact that due to the melting of the last great ice sheets from 20,000 years ago, Scotland is still actually rising, and it's a sort of a pivot point in the north of England, whereby the south of England and Wales is actually somewhat sinking as the Earth's crust and the Earth's mantle readjusts to not having a big lump of ice on it anymore. So that's one of the principal reasons for getting the difference between those values, whether you're in the north or in the south. The other one is also actually the effect that if you melt the Greenland ice sheet, you actually slightly lower sea level in the northwest of Scotland, because actually less water is being dragged towards the ice sheet on Greenland by gravity, which is a wonderfully fascinating concept, and one that I always find really interesting, but perhaps don't have time to really go into here. But if you are interested, it's certainly worth finding out more, and our documentation around the UKCP marine projections does discuss it. Adaptation Scotland, who I've had the great pleasure of working with throughout my time working with the Outer Hebrides, have produced a range of projections, and the summary for Scotland very much sort of focuses on taking the UKCP information, but just distilling it for the Scottish area. And again, there's the general message remains the same of warmer, wetter winters with more intense rainfall events, and that Scotland will experience hotter, drier summers, but with greater extremes in temperature into the future. And the link's been provided towards Adaptation Scotland's report, so you can actually go and actually find out more information on their work there. So I'll pause there, and then I'll move on to the next video, which actually focus on the climate of the Outer Hebrides.